Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UNU-INWEH public event, the Science Talks. I am your host, Professor Grace Oluwasonya. Before presenting our distinguished speaker for this morning's talk, please note that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the presentation. At that point, there will be room for comments, Q&A, and any other contributions you may have. Please type your questions or comments in the Q&A chat box. We'll pick it up from there at the Q&A interactive session. Thank you, everyone. The topic of today's talk is towards an inclusive water, energy, food nexus framework for planetary health. So let's talk. Our presenter is Professor Tafadzwa, for short, MABHAUDHI. I hope I got the pronunciation well. Who is he? Professor Tafad leads the Water, Energy, Food and Environment Nexus at UNU-INWEH here, and is also pivotal in establishing the UNU-INWEH Africa Academy on Water, Environment and Health. He's a globally recognized researcher and science advocate working on complex water, energy, food, and environmental systems at the interface of science, policy, and society. Previously, he was the research group leader for sustainable and resilient food systems at the International Water Management Institute and the founder and co-director of the Center for Transformative Agricultural and Food Systems at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Apart from being the lead in water and energy, food and environment at INWEH, he's also a professor of climate change, food systems and health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also the director, Institute for Natural Resources, South Africa. He is an editor of several high-impact journals and holds strategic roles in various advisory committees and panels. So, join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Professor Tafadzwa MABHAUDHI. You're welcome, Professor Tafad. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Grace. Just the other day, I was having an interview on TV about the climate disasters happening in Cape Town. And the presenter really butchered my name.
Wow. So, I hope I enjoyed that.
So
we'll
for you,
Professor Tafad, for short.
Gratefully, you didn't butcher it at all. Yeah, it's Tafadzwa MABHAUDHI.
Okay.
Yeah. So otherwise, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And a pleasure to be joining you today on these UNU Science Talks. And I'll be presenting today about work that we are still doing. It's work that is still in progress on developing a planetary health sensitive framework for the water, energy, food nexus. Let me get started. Yeah, so I think you've pretty much covered the background in terms of who I am. So most people ask me about how I manage the different roles and different heads. And I recently explained it to people when I was in Malaysia to say it is exactly that. It is different heads, but the same head. So it's not multiple heads, it's just the one head and different heads. And I think we're talking today about a topic in research that is transdisciplinary, which cuts across academia, policy, practice, and working with a range of actors. And sometimes you you find that when you work in these cross-cutting areas, you need to wear different hats for different occasions so that you engage in different spaces. So whilst the head is the same, sometimes it helps to approach issues from a different perspective and with a different audience. So all those roles actually merge well into just one agenda, which seeks to transform water, energy, food, and ecosystems, focusing on Africa and Asia, and with a big push on capacity building and informing policy and practice. So coming to today's presentation, I think when we talk about water, energy, and food, we are basically talking about SDGs 2, 6, and 7. And those 3 SDGs are very central and catalytic to most of the other SDGs. So from the perspective of the water, energy, food nexus, we have always argued that if we are able to tackle these 3 interlinked SDGs, or these 3 interlinked systems, water, energy, and food systems, it could have a catalytic effect on the other interlinked systems. So if we can target those, we could be able to address poverty, we could be able to address climate change, we could be able to address issues of partnerships, equity. So there are various other things that are linked to it that we could be able to then address through what we call a nexus approach. And part of that conversation is leading to where now you've got various iterations of the water, energy, food nexus. Sometimes you hear it being called the WEF with an ecosystems or environment at the end. Some are now saying WEF with environment and health. Some say WEF with an L for land. Some put a C for climate change. But the essence of it is that those 3 resources link into many other spaces. So we are now gravitating towards just saying the WEF plus nexus to say it can be with other things, but the focus being on the 3 primary resources. From the perspective of where we are, where most of my research is located in Africa, the main question that we look at, or that we're trying to answer, is how do we sustainably increase food production to meet growing demand, but all at the same time without pushing or exceeding any of the planetary boundaries. So we've got a developmental imperative, but at the same time we've got a need to stick within the planetary boundaries. So how do we see the Nexus approach then coming in? When we look at the Nexus approach, we are basically trying to integrate food systems, climate, and health through the resources. So water, energy, and food systems underpinning the resource base, and the understanding of trade-offs across these systems, trying to address questions around how can the approach support systems transformation to deliver sustainable and resilient food systems, and how can it be applied to enhance use and scaling of planetary health sensitive innovations. And in doing so, there have been many frameworks that have been developed. And part of the work that I'll be talking about today is where we are in terms of the frameworks. So when we talk about the nexus, generally the nexus is divided into 3 sort of domains. The first domain is the concept itself, understanding of trade-offs and linkages and synergies. The second is the analytical, which is then being able to quantify those trade-offs and synergies. And the third being the discourse, which is the space where you then translate the understanding, the concept, the understanding of the trade-offs and synergies into the space of informing policy and practice, which is now discourse. And the gap really is now at the discourse level, because we've spent since 2011, when the Nexus came into prominence, we've spent a great deal of time understanding the concept. We've spent a great deal of time developing tools so that we can analyze and quantify a lot of these relationships. But the challenge that we are now faced with is, how do we now move from this space to start doing some practical things? So we're now in this stage where there's a lot of emphasis on moving the WEF nexus from theory to practice. How do we start implementing? How do we bring the thinking and the analysis from this approach into the space of actually informing decisions? What sort of decisions can we inform, and at what scale can we inform those decisions? Is it at the local scale? Is it at the catchment scale? Is it national, regional, global? So those are the issues that we are now grappling with in terms of how do we operationalize the WEF nexus. So frameworks become important, because basically a framework tells us how do we move from theory to practice. What are the steps that we need to take? What are the considerations? How can we actually do these things in practice? Within the context of the WEF, what we have learned from the theory and the analytical that we have done so far is that the challenges are in terms of policy coherence and implementation gaps and policy implementation scale. Those are the three primary domains of challenges. So the coherence is a lack of coherence between the different sectors involved: water, energy, and food. The implementation gaps with regards to having policies, plans, and strategies that do not always bring about the desired or envisaged outputs and outcomes. And the policy scale mismatch is the focus on global challenges at the exclusion of the local context, which often means that you've got solutions that are developed at a global level, but that are disconnected from the local context. So we've been theorizing around how do we move, and part of the challenge when it comes to how do we move from theory to practice is understanding the fact that the outcome space that the nexus needs to develop or to deliver to is a social and ecological space. We want to deliver human and planetary outcomes of well-being. So how do we demonstrate that relevance? So that is where the planetary health perspective comes into context. So in terms of the planetary health perspective and an anthropocentric, nexus approach, which is what we are advocating for now, it's basically the understanding that the resources or the systems that we are trying to manage have been getting shaped or have been shaped by human activities, and the pressures that are now being exerted on these systems and the unsustainability of these systems is basically an outcome of the process of people. At the same time, the failure of these systems to now deliver affects people as well. So it's a catch-22 kind of situation, and that the way we have managed our resources has led to a situation where those resources are actually now in critical stages. It's unsustainable, and they may not be able to continue delivering for us. And then at the same time, on the other side, we are affected, especially in regions that are still developing, that have high levels of poverty and inequality, where people still do not have universal access to water, sanitation, hygiene, electricity, and hunger and poverty still persist, those issues become problematic and are being amplified by this situation. Equally, at the same time, it's putting pressure on the planetary boundaries and that whole unsustainability. So we thought, because of the focus on wanting to deliver people outcomes, but within a planetary framework that does not exceed the planetary boundaries as they are, we could adopt a planetary health framework. So why are we using a planetary health framework? Because public health and planetary health impacts planetary impacts. So each of these challenges that I've mentioned to you, taken on their own, presents a monumental threat to human well-being and environmental well-being. So we need approaches that look at them in an integrated way and in a systematic way, so that we start shifting the needle in terms of the outcomes that we are delivering. We deliver outcomes that are sustainable to people, but also sustainable for the planet. That is why we have said, in this particular context, let's look at developing a planetary health WEF Nexus framework. So what we hope to achieve with this work is putting together a combination of socio-economic dynamics that shape humanity through the WEF Nexus lens, a broadened WEF Nexus lens, as I mentioned, taking into consideration issues of gender, equity, equality, inclusion, and diversity, and paying attention to indigenous knowledge and local people, especially those who are vulnerable and marginalized, and looking at how the WEF Nexus approach can be a transformative approach to actually bring about greater social inclusion, equity, and equality through the realization of simultaneous water, energy, and food securities, and unlocking things such as job and wealth creation through sustainable natural resource management. So a planetary health nexus framework is more than just analyzing and addressing the impacts or the management of the systems, but it is also looking at the equitable access to these resources for all, pretty much trying to speak to the leave no one behind mantra. So part of the analysis that we did was to look at the different frameworks that exist. So there are quite a lot of frameworks that already exist, that have been published over the years that the Nexus has come into prominence. And there are certain things that are common around all of them in terms of the thematic analysis and what they address. Most of them are speaking around achieving some socio-ecological changes. They identify a set of drivers of change. So these can be categorized into environmental drivers and societal drivers. There are certain risks and vulnerabilities that threaten or that amplify these drivers. And then there are also a lot of other factors. There are barriers. There are some actions that need to be taken in order for us to move towards a more transdisciplinary and achieve resilience and adaptation. So this is just summarizing some of the analysis that we did in terms of the various frameworks that exist and the different things that they look at. But the key thing is not all of them look at these things together. They each have very different focus. Some are focused, most are focused primarily on the resource base itself, managing the resources. Hence, they are very technical and detached from people and planetary outcomes. Only a few, for example, one by bigs, is looking at the livelihoods aspect. So it attempts to link the resources to people outcomes, but again, it's still very technical and also does not consider the ecological outcomes as being critical. There is one framework that we managed to pick, which was done by Simpson and others. And this is as recent as 2020, and they called it the anthropocentric WEF Nexus framework. So it does recognize the impact or the human impact on the resource base, the three primary resources. And at the core of it, it looks at equitable access, focusing on people. So this one would say, in terms of the analysis that we looked at, was the closest to a planetary health sensitive or inclusive framework. In terms of the actual analysis of the existing frameworks, so we did an analysis where we produced this thematic map, which shows different, basic motor, niche, and emerging themes. And the cluster or the bubble size, the size, represents how much evidence it is. So more specifically, the water and its proxies, irrigation, water supply, and food systems dominated the WEF Nexus research based on the criteria. So the existing frameworks tend to have an overemphasis on water, meaning that they are actually deviating from the polycentric aspect of the WEF Nexus. One of the things that was almost absent in the literature or in the analyzed frameworks was a dimension that situates human health within human systems. So that was quiet and silent. And what was also lacking are the transformative pathways in terms of how to operationalize the WEF nexus itself. So most of the frameworks that we looked at did not really show clear ways in terms of how do we move into operationalization and how do we actually address the key gaps of linking the resources to the people and planet. In terms of how we then combined the different types of analysis, we have been looking at the statements that emerged from the recent COP, the one that was in Dubai, where some very key declarations and statements emerged from that process around, the development of climate change and health, sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, biodiversity and climate. So there are some key considerations that emerged from that process that we were then able to leverage in terms of how do we integrate better the resource base to deliver on planetary health, not just the resources themselves. So currently, this is what we are looking at. It's still in draft mode, and we are still developing it. We are planning a stakeholder consultation in August as part of a regional summit that we'll be doing here in Southern Africa to get more input into the framework. But what we are looking at is, at the core, is planetary health with the associated benefits, which is healthy ecosystems, human health, social inclusion, gender equality, and equitable access to the resources, which should be at the center of the proposed framework. So those are the outcomes that we want to achieve. And humankind, or people, are the beneficiaries of these resources, and they're also the custodians and stewards of these resources. And within the human sphere are human activities such as population growth, economic growth, and dietary choices that are impacting the resource base, which is water, energy, and food. The bidirectional arrows between the natural and governance spheres indicate how humans and their associated lifestyle choices and decisions and governance can affect or impact the natural realm. And then in green are suggestions on how policies can be designed to support technologies and practices that are not detrimental to the natural realm. And these are not exhaustive, but are examples of strategies that could be taken to improve our impact on planetary health. And then in red, unsustainable practices that lead to unhealthy ecosystems and environmental degradation, which would ultimately negatively impact humankind through resource scarcity and a rise in human health related problems. Within the governance realm, we suggest governance structures and policies that support or strengthen indigenous knowledge systems, gender transformative approaches, and that support innovations that allow for participation from all economic, social, and cultural backgrounds in terms of how we manage the WEF resources. So that is speaking to custodianship and stewardship. Now, in terms of managing the transition as we move across these different spheres, this is a diagram, a systems analysis, which we have just completed. So this is the first draft as well, which we are hoping to improve on through consultation. So it identifies 3 levels of complexity, which define the structure of socio-technical activities. And those socio-technical perspectives basically include social, ecological, technological systems, highlighting a need to embrace a practical perspective as an overarching philosophy or approach to the management. And this has relevance, especially for the global south and sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So niche transitions, these seed systemic change and consist of 4 dynamic themes which we have identified through our focus for the planetary health-centric WEF Nexus. And these we hope would be catalytic to unleash the emerging themes that can stimulate broader systemic change, or what is called regime change in terms of systems analysis. But we might need to change that term, regime change. I think it might create some awkwardness in political circles. But when we speak of this transition or this regime transition, which is the shift in evidence and the rules and norms that co-evolve towards increasing sustainability, we then consider the landscape also as an overarching global goal for planetary health. So far we've got the WEF Nexus health or planetary health-centric framework, which I've shared. And we've also got this transition management planetary health-centric approach that we then want to embed together with the framework. So key points to take home. As I said, this is work in development, and why we are taking a planetary health perspective, because it does not just refer to human health, it is inclusive and it covers all other dimensions that are of interest to us from a sustainability perspective. The governance of WEF resources should be inclusive to consider the voices of marginalized groups in society, so mostly women, youth, and indigenous people. Access to WEF resources should not be measured in quantitative terms only, e.g. availability per capita. We also need to have social or other types of measuring access to these resources. And there should be deliberate efforts in terms of ensuring that marginalized social groups have equitable access for their dignity and equity. The practical implications of this, as I mentioned, we derived these, mostly we looked at key declarations coming out of the recent COP, looking at climate, nature, and people, and climate and health. and also in the context of how do we accelerate progress towards achieving the SDGs, and how can the WEF Nexus be catalytic in terms of accelerating that progress. So just a heads up, we're going to be having a summit, a regional summit in Southern Africa on 19 and 20 August in Pretoria, where we're going to delve into that subject of accelerating progress towards the SDGs through the Nexus approach. And we'll also use the opportunity to further refine this framework. So basically, this is a theory of change that summarizes and encapsulates all that I've been saying in terms of how do we move from the theory, and the theory, what it has basically done is to build a shared understanding of what the Nexus approach is. How do we then harness the research, development, and innovations that have been done in the Nexus space? That is most of the frameworks that have already been developed, the analytical side of it, and how do we use that to achieve transformation towards, achieving sustainable, inclusive, and equitable development that addresses human and environmental outcomes across several areas and several SDGs. So that's basically the sum of what I've been saying, and where we hope the planetary health centric framework will come in to really help us move from theory to practice in terms of addressing the key gaps and also informing implementation. Now, to close off, a lot of what I've talked about is research that has been done by a broader set of partners, and those partners, we have come together across the globe to form what we call the Global WEF Nexus Community of Practice. And within this practice, this community, we aim to share knowledge on data tools. So I mentioned that there are a lot of tools that have been developed. There is a lot of theory that has been developed. So we share and exchange a lot of that. And we convene activities together. So such as the seminar that we'll be convening in August in Pretoria. Before that, we'll be convening, we call it a winter school in the Southern Hemisphere. In the Northern Hemisphere, it will be a summer school, but we convene training and capacity development workshops. We launched a blog, and this is basically a community for researchers, early, mid, and senior students, policymakers, and practitioners. It is a user-inspired and demand-driven organic platform. So it is not owned by anyone. It is not funded by anyone. It is just a group of interested people where we come together and share knowledge and solutions. And I would encourage you all to join. As I said, most of the research that I was referring to has been conducted by partners and people who form part of this Global WEF Nexus community. Otherwise, thank you very much. And back to you, Grace.
Thank you very much. Martin, can you mute me? Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Tafadzwa. That's quite complex, and multifaceted. That's my initial reaction to read. It's welcoming, at least from my perspective, that scientists are now gearing towards people-centric, moving away from this engineering concept of just designing stuff for users without incorporating the needs, concerns, and the practices of the users, that they're actually designing for. So we've come a long way, as scientists now trying to rigorously incorporate the human dimension into whatsoever we are doing. My first question to you will be, it's always interesting getting the human dimension in, and a science base around the human dimension that one needs to factor into this kind of work will be behavioral science. So is there a way in which you've conceptualized behavioral science as a factor into these planetary health centric WEF framework?
So we haven't factored behavioral science per se, but we have considered it as one of the sort of like impact areas when we speak of transformation. So it's not just transforming the systems per se, that's the technical approach. Part of the transformation is social transformation in terms of how people interact or perceive the resource base. So for example, the way people relate with the environment has mostly been informed from a protectionist perspective, which we as scientists sort of put in place to say, don't touch, like slapping people when it comes to natural resources. But what that has done is to disconnect people from the value, the inherent value of preserving and protecting the environment as something that they benefit from, because now it's something that seems to be just protected and detached from them. So it becomes in some way easy for people to do certain practices that might be detrimental to the environment. But if we change that perspective in terms of how we understand the environment around us as something that we benefit from and can contribute into for our benefit, which is a sort of behavioral change that is needed. That's where I was talking about stewardship and custodianship of the environment as key tenets that we would want to consider.
Okay, and still a follow-on question in that I want to think that it would be a good place to actually get that in, because I know a bit in that space. It's essential at this point to identify, for instance, the risky behaviors or at-risk behaviors, that will keep interacting, in this kind of space, so that one can get a very robust outcome at the end, of the day. All right. My colleague Martin, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes. What is it?
Oh,
so there is
okay.
a question.
Yes. Yes, go ahead if you have a question, please.
No. I see there is a Q&A. You can look in the Q&A.
Thank you. All right. I believe questions will still come in, beyond now. And if any comes in after the program, Professor Tafad, I would send them to you for your reaction and post it back. Now, what is your take for upcoming researchers, upcoming scientists, that are kind of interested in this space? So what will be your candid advice to them?
I think my candid advice, I think Martin was saying something.
There is a question from Dr. M.N. Cho in the Q&A. So I can read that. Thanks, Professor, for impressive presentation. Is the Planetary Health WEF Nexus framework that your team is working on a global framework? If yes, can it be applied at local scale?
So we have designed the framework to be a scalable framework. So the approach that we are asking is emphasizing local solutions to global challenges. So it's a global framework, but that is underpinned on, application at a local level, but responding to the global challenges. So it can be applied at a local scale.
Okay,
And
thank
then
you for that.
back to your question, Grace. I think in terms of advice to early career researchers who might want to come into this Nexus space, as I said, I think the field has emerged around 2011. That's when it became very topical because of the World Economic Forum, where they really profiled it. So the research since then has really taken off, but a lot of the research has so far been theoretical. The major gap in knowledge right now is around the practical application of the Nexus approach and demonstrating its relevance towards people and environmental issues. So no one disputes its value as a way of thinking, but people criticize it because there is no way you can go and say, if you look here, this has been done from a Nexus approach, and this is obviously better than what you see elsewhere because we did it this way. So I think for early career researchers coming into this space, those would be the research questions to address in terms of practicalizing the approach. And to also say to them that, Rome wasn't built in a day. So whilst that is the question that is there right now, they should also allow themselves time to really think deeper, analyze the question deeply from their perspective and specialization, and then give themselves time to actually conduct meaningful research that would come up with useful outcomes.
Thank you for that. But immediately I'm guessing it like you said, it's going to definitely be an interdisciplinary, approach, because it's quite massive. You're considering so many factors, pretty much at the same time, so this may be one of the reason why you have that practice gap in terms of implementation, because it can't just be one person. Is like in water safety planning. For you to, have a meaningful water safety planning, you need to bring all the stakeholders, all the expert stakeholders together at a table, to look at the whole thing, holistically. So that's why I'm curious that, okay, for upcoming scientists, we'll be having like a synergy. And for instance, traditional PhD, it's actually a lone ranger, so to say. So how do you advise they go about the navigate around this?
Okay, so these days we talk more about transdisciplinary research, and I think it's important to do it and do it sincerely. So a lot of PhDs are now interdisciplinary in the sense that the topics that students are doing at PhD are cutting across several disciplines. So you work on water, but you work on water in the context of maybe quality, and quality is linked to human health or is linked to pollution and environmental health. So it will almost always cut across several disciplines. But that is still an easy conversation to manage because you're still dealing with technical issues when you're interdisciplinary. So you can still understand and work with each other and pretty much work at the same temperament. Now, when we talk of transdisciplinarity, which is what you are talking about, that is where we now involve non-academic stakeholders. That is where politicians come into the space. That is where, practitioners, people working in municipalities and some of the agencies that have a mandate to implement come into this space. That is where communities come into the space. And I think a challenge that people usually have when it comes to transdisciplinarity. It's being true to the essence when we say co-understanding, co-develop, co-design, co-implement, co-evaluate. Because often we skip the first two aspects, which is co-identification of the problem and building a shared understanding around the problem. Because you usually have your research topic already with a defined problem. So even by the time you come to engage, you are already engaging around a particular problem that has been defined, and you don't create the space for people to actually say, maybe that's not the problem. The problem maybe lies elsewhere. So I think it's being true to that transdisciplinary, innovation pathway of problem co-identification, and then building a shared understanding, in that we are all understanding the problem in the same way and agreeing that this is the problem. And then how do we start moving towards solving it? So if you do all the steps together, then the implementation gaps start to narrow, because you are implementing together and monitoring and evaluating together. Generally, what has happened in the past is where solutions or problem identification is done elsewhere, the solution is developed elsewhere, and then delivered to whoever the intended user is supposed to be. And there might be some, point of training for the user to say, this is how you use it. But the user has not been involved in the other value chain. So that's, I think, early career researchers, they've got a very good opportunity. Some of us are old, and it's very difficult for old dogs to learn new tricks or to unlearn things that we have been doing, which might not be good practice. But early career researchers are still learning. They don't have to unlearn anything. So they can learn a lot of good practice in terms of, proper engagement meaningfully.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more Q&A, Martin?
No, I have a question.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Tafat. It's a very exciting presentation. One of my thing is, so whenever we want to do a Nexus approach, even in the smaller spatial scale, it is very complicated. And then if you want to do it at the planetary scale, is enormous. So how you support this framework and Nexus using like data and information? So because what data you want to feed in your framework to show how that Nexus is actually happening, and then because and how to trade off between these different component of Nexus at that scale, because and what kind of data you think can be used for demonstrating that trade-offs and Nexus things and interaction between different components. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the big questions that has always been asked is that question of scale. And it's been asked in two ways. First is the technical way of, being able to conduct analysis and then having data available at different scales. The second has been at the implementation from the practitioners to say, this was like in Southern Africa when we developed the framework at a regional level. The question from the Council of Ministers was, okay, this is nice, but where do we locate it? Is it a national competence? Is it provincial? Is it local municipality? Or is it catchment based? Like, where do we locate it in that sense? And also from a cost benefit perspective, at which scale does it make sense to make such type of investments that are driven from that perspective? So that's always been a question. What we have responded from a research perspective is we've got different types of analysis. So there's what is called the Global WEF Nexus Index. There's a website available if you look it up, the wefnexusindex.org. So this does global analysis and it pulls in global data sets that are available from the UN type agencies. And then it gives you global and national type analysis in terms of the WEF Nexus status at country level, as well as an analysis of trade-offs at a country level. We have also done analysis. There's another tool called the Integrated WEF Analytical Tool, iwef.app, and that does regional, national, and local. And for local, it is so far done at a local municipality level and catchment level. So those sort of analysis have been done. And more recently, just this year, we have been able to do household level analysis where we're able to use household level data that is available from some national surveys that are done at a household level to then look at the nexus from a household perspective. So in all of these analyses, we have been able to now apply the nexus at household, local, municipal, catchment, national, regional, and global scales with very good results. And the important thing is to then understand that at each different scale, the decisions that then need to be made differ. So at a household level, it's managing use really or supply. At a local level, it's demand management. And then at a national level, it's demand and supply management. When you are at a regional level, you are then looking at the transboundary nature of resources, especially water and some of these like transfrontier conservation areas where there's a need for better integration at a regional level. And then at a global level, it's more in terms of managing, equity and equality in terms of access from an access perspective. So the decision types would differ in terms of the scale that you are doing your analysis at. That would be my answer. I see some questions here, Grace, in the Q&A.
Can you please pick it up?
Yeah, there's a question from Miriam that says, can you please talk about the idea of a community of practice and how researchers can ensure research moves from theory to implementation? So a community of practice is, depending on how you develop it, it can be a community of practice that is entirely made up of researchers, of which in that instance, you're not going to be able to move things because they are still the same group of people. Or it can be a community of practice like ours that cuts across. It's got academics, it's got policymakers, it's got practitioners, it's got all sorts of people with different interests and different backgrounds. So the importance of it really, of having a community of practice, is the conceptualization stage. That if you've got all of these different people, when you're conceptualizing, your ability to conceptualize a problem is enriched because you've got multiple perspectives. The way you move from problem to solution, again, is very unique because you are not moving alone. You are moving with partners, and each partner has different competencies and capacities. So if you leverage all of those, obviously those in the implementation space, what they will offer is, to pilot things for you, which is basically to implement. They say, if you can develop a prototype or a pilot, we can provide the space to pilot it. We can go to this particular space, we will do it, we can manage it. So already by having the different actors, if we were to consider it as a value chain, it would mean you've got the different players of a value chain involved, which is what your community of practice can do. So it can complete the value chain, as opposed to if you're just researchers, you're just the entry point of the value chain, which is knowledge generation and production. You don't have the people who refine the knowledge. You don't have the people who then implement and evaluate and so forth. So that's the beauty of a community of practice. It's difficult to establish because usually for it to be true, it has to be sort of organic, that people have to find, interests. There must be a value proposition that you give where people then identify with the value and buy into it. So finding again that common, issue, or defining a vision that people can identify and buy into from different walks of life. So it has to be a vision that does not just appeal to researchers, but also appeals to policymakers, also appeals to practitioners, and also just appeals to an ordinary person who's curious about what's going on. So articulating the vision becomes very important in establishing a community of practice to ensure that it is broad-based, and then removing barriers within the community of practice and ensuring that it is not hierarchical, so that all voices are heard and everyone can participate and contribute. So removing those barriers and issues of hierarchy to ensure that it is inclusive and there's, cohesiveness. So there's a lot that goes into establishing it and then keeping it operational and functional. The next question is coming from Sogo. She asks, how could we account for the climate risks and the change in these multiple complex systems as we go forward? How would you suggest we prepare for the unintended consequences on planetary health, especially when it comes to change in social structures impacting WEF? So I think what we are trying to do, I've got a PhD who has been working on this, is we've so far got models that quantify trade-offs in the WEF nexus. So we are able to assess and quantify trade-offs and say, in this, we even have an index, a composite index, that can tell you whether the WEF in a particular area is sustainable or unsustainable, and what is driving unsustainability. Is it an emphasis on managing water, or is it an overemphasis on food self-sufficiency or sovereignty, energy security, and so forth? What we have not so far managed to do is to develop scenarios and pathways. So currently the research, because we've got climate change scenarios, we've got the RCPs and SSPs, combining the RCPs and SSPs, and in the context of the WEF, also combining it with the RAPs, the agricultural ones, and then using those combined scenarios to drive these models, would then allow us now to be able to assess, those risks on the system. And assuming if we are using the SSPs in that analysis, that would also consider the change in human, sort of the human space, the social space. So that is something that is ongoing. I'm hoping that guy submits his thesis to me this year, and we'll have an answer. But he'll be at the summit in August and hopefully make a presentation of his research on how we are accounting for climate risks and change.
All right. We really used up all our time. I appreciate the engaging community of participants this morning, that joined in and made today's talk quite interactive. So on this note, I want to say a big thank you to you once again, Professor Tafadzwa. And thank you for the insights provided. Now I'm thinking maybe I should jump ship and join the Global Wealth Nexus community in terms of research interest. I'm sure you'll be happy to have me or anyone who is interested in joining. So once again, on behalf of my director, thank you for participating. Thank you for the interesting talk. And for everyone who had managed to log in, and join us today, thank you so much. So we look forward to seeing you once again next week. Thank you, everyone.